I never thought the distance between me and my father would grow so quietly. There wasn't a big fight, no slammed doors, no final conversation that marked the beginning of our silence. It just happened, like a slow fog rolling in. You don't notice it right away until you realize you can't see the road ahead or the person next to you. When I was younger, I used to think my dad had all the answers. I looked up to him. His voice was steady, his rules were clear, and his presence filled a room in a way that made me feel safe, even when I didn't understand him. But somewhere along the line, that comfort turned into tension. Every word started to feel like a judgment, every silence a disapproval. The thing is, we both thought the other person changed. He'd look at me like I was drifting away from everything he believed in, and maybe I was. But it wasn't rebellion. I was just trying to become who I actually was. And I think he felt like he was losing the version of me he'd always imagined. What neither of us saw back then was that this wasn't just a story about a son growing up or a father holding on. It was about two people trapped in the belief that they were alone in their hurt. We were both standing on opposite sides of a river, waiting for the other to build the bridge. There were small things that built up over time, little jabs that turned into silence. I'd call less, he'd ask fewer questions. When we did talk, it was mostly surface-level stuff. Weather, work, if I'd changed the oil in my car. The deeper things, the ones that really mattered, those stayed locked up. I think we were both afraid that opening those doors would let out too much pain. I used to tell myself he just didn't get me, that he was stuck in his ways, too old school to understand the world I lived in now. And maybe that was partly true, but it was also easy. Easier than admitting I hadn't really tried to understand him either. I assumed he'd never change. He probably thought the same about me. And that's how we ended up living with this quiet disappointment. Like background noise we'd both learned to tune out. It wasn't until I started reading Jung, actually, that something clicked. That line. What we do not make conscious appears in our lives as fate. God, that hit me hard. I realized I had been playing out a script I didn't even know I was following. Not just with my dad, but in other relationships too. Always waiting for someone else to change first, to reach out, to say, I'm sorry, to go first. But what if they were waiting for the same thing? There was a Sunday afternoon not too long ago. Gray skies, nothing special. I sat in my car outside his house for almost 15 minutes trying to decide whether to go in. We hadn't talked properly in months, but something in me just cracked. Not in a dramatic way, more like a soft breaking, like the moment you realize you've been carrying too much for too long. I went in. We didn't talk about the past, not at first. I asked about the old record player, the one he kept in the garage. He lit up a little, told me it still worked, just needed a new needle. And for a second, I saw the man who used to dance with me in the living room when I was 5. Not the judge, not the stranger. Just my dad. I think that was the moment I understood that all these years, he hadn't been trying to push me away. He'd been grieving, not just the idea of who he thought I would be, but the closeness we used to share. And like me, he didn't know how to say that out loud. It's easier to hide behind opinions, silence, or routine than to say, I miss you, but I don't know how to reach you anymore. That visit didn't fix everything, but it was a beginning, a crack in the armor, a little light. I still catch myself wanting to blame him sometimes, to count all the ways he failed me, but I also see now how I failed him too. Not out of malice, but out of fear. We both let the fog grow thick between us, thinking we were protecting ourselves, but really we were just getting lost. It's strange how the deepest wounds often come not from what was said, but from what wasn't, from all the moments when love was there, but locked behind pride, confusion, or pain. And maybe that's the tragedy of it. And the hope. Because if something is still there, even buried, maybe it can be found again. Anyway, that's where it began for me. Not in some big reconciliation or dramatic outburst, but in a quiet decision. I don't want to live my life waiting for someone else to go first. If the bridge has to be built, maybe I can pick up the first stone. You know what I've realized? Most of the expectations that weighed me down didn't come from enemies or strangers. They came from people who loved me. That's the part that's hardest to swallow. It wasn't malice. It was love twisted into something tighter, something heavier, something that stopped feeling like support and started feeling like a cage. My dad had dreams for me, not in a cliché live through my son kind of way, at least not intentionally. But looking back, I can see it so clearly now. The subtle nudges, the way his eyes lit up when I mentioned something that aligned with what he valued. The quiet disappointments when I didn't. At the time, I thought I was making my own choices, but now I know that for a long time I was living to protect his smile. I think that's what made it so hard to understand myself. Because I wasn't just trying to be a good son, I was trying to be the right kind of son. The one he could be proud of at family gatherings. The one whose choices he could nod along with. And when I started wanting things that didn't fit into that mold, guilt came crashing in. Not loud, not dramatic, just this quiet voice whispering, if you really loved him, you wouldn't disappoint him like this. That's when I started to split in two. There was the version of me I showed him, polite, agreeable, filtered, and then there was the version of me I was still trying to figure out, the one I kept hidden, even from myself. It's funny, isn't it? We spend so much time trying to earn the love we already had, not realizing that in the process, we stop loving ourselves. And it's not just him. I've seen it in friends too, people who became lawyers or nurses or teachers, not because they felt called to it, but because someone in their family once said, "You'd be great at that." And suddenly, that offhand comment becomes a life sentence. You wake up years later in a job, a relationship, a whole existence that looks good on paper, but feels hollow. Jung talked about this as the tension between persona and shadow, the mask we wear to be accepted, and the parts of us we hide to keep that acceptance. But what happens when the mask gets too heavy? When the hidden parts start to ache for air? That's where I found myself, smiling at dinner while a piece of me quietly withered. And the tragedy is parents often don't know they're doing it. They think they're guiding, protecting, loving. My dad wasn't trying to hurt me. He was trying to help me succeed in the only way he knew, his way, his dream. And that's where the conflict begins, not in the absence of love, but in the assumption that love must look a certain way. I remember one night we were sitting at the table and he said, almost offhand, "You could have done something bigger with your life." I don't even think he meant it to hurt, but it landed like a stone. Because in his eyes, success had a shape, and I didn't fit it. I laughed it off, I always did, but inside, a little more of me curled up. That's what unspoken shame does. It doesn't erupt, it erodes. It tells you you're loved, but only on these terms. And yet, it's not all dark, because somewhere in all that weight, there's also a truth waiting to be seen, that my life, the one I've slowly, awkwardly carved out, is mine. That being misunderstood doesn't mean I'm wrong. That choosing a different path isn't a betrayal, it's an act of self-respect. Still, I carry the echoes of his voice in my head. And not just his, teachers, mentors, relatives, all the people who meant well, who said, "You should," or "You must," or "Don't disappoint me." They didn't know they were planting seeds of confusion, but they did. And it took me years to realize that the garden I was watering wasn't mine. Now I'm learning to walk away from it, not out of anger, but out of clarity. I don't blame him anymore. I don't blame myself either. I just see it now. The pattern, the loop, the inherited belief that being loved means being who they need you to be. And breaking that belief, that's the real work. Because here's the thing, you can love your parents and still not live their story. You can honor their struggles, respect their intentions, and still choose a life that's wildly, unapologetically your own. That's what I'm trying to do now. Not out of rebellion, but out of integrity. Not to prove anything, but to finally be someone who doesn't flinch at his own reflection. And weirdly enough, I think that's the kind of son my dad needed all along. Not the one who fit his dreams, but the one who had the courage to find his own. There's this phrase that used to echo in my head. You don't talk to me with respect. I heard it more times than I can count growing up. Sometimes it came after I raised my voice, sometimes after I dared to disagree, but most of the time it came simply because I had an opinion that didn't match his. And each time I felt the same sting, not just from the accusation, but from the implication that respect meant silence, that love had to look like obedience. The strange thing is, I actually did respect him, deeply. I admired how hard he worked, how much he gave, how much of himself he poured into our family without ever asking for anything in return. But somewhere along the way, our definitions of respect stopped matching. He saw it as compliance. I saw it as honesty. And that difference lit the fuse between us. It starts with tone. Don't talk to me like that. Watch your mouth. You know those phrases? I think every child hears some version of them. At first, they feel like discipline, but over time, they start to teach you something quieter, that it's not safe to fully show up, that your feelings are too much, that pushing back means you're the problem, so you adapt. You lower your voice or raise your walls. You say less, feel less, show less, not because you've stopped caring, but because it's easier than walking into another emotional ambush. For me, I took the path of silence. I started saying only what wouldn't get a reaction. How's work? Good. Everything okay? Yeah. I became an expert in small talk with my own father, not because I wanted to, but because I was tired of every honest moment turning into a power struggle. And he did the same in his own way. He stopped asking deeper questions, stopped sharing parts of himself that made him vulnerable. We both built walls and called it peace. But it wasn't peace. It was avoidance dressed in politeness. The sad part? We both thought we were doing the right thing. He thought he was teaching boundaries. I thought I was keeping the relationship intact. But really, we were just protecting our egos and letting our connection slowly starve. Carl Jung once said that unaddressed pain doesn't disappear. It just reappears in the next conflict. I believe that. Every time I raised my voice, I wasn't just arguing about this topic. I was bleeding from a dozen old wounds that had never been seen. And he too reacted not to me in the present, but to ghosts of his own past, his own father's voice, his own unmet need for respect. And so we danced this endless dance, me pushing, him retreating, him controlling, me shutting down. We weren't father and son anymore. We were two wounded boys trapped in adult bodies trying to protect ourselves from each other. What no one tells you is that disrespect doesn't always sound like yelling. Sometimes it sounds like coldness, like not picking up the phone, like saying fine when you mean I'm exhausted. Sometimes the most painful forms of disconnection aren't loud. They're quiet. But there's something else no one tells you, that the cycle can stop. That mutual respect isn't something you demand. It's something you offer. That healing doesn't come from being right, but from being willing. The first time I told him calmly, I hear you, but I see things differently. I expected another explosion. I braced for it, but it didn't come. He paused, and for a split second, I saw something soften in his eyes. Not agreement, but maybe Curiosity? It wasn't a miracle. It didn't fix years of damage. But it was different, and sometimes different is enough to begin. I've learned since then that respect is a two-way street, and no one arrives there by force. It starts with humility, the willingness to look at your own part in the breakdown, and it deepens with patience, the kind that keeps showing up even when the other person can't meet you yet. Sometimes offering respect first isn't weakness, it's strength. It says, I don't need to win this, I just want to see you and be seen. That's what I want now, not control, not apology, just presence, just to talk like two humans again, without the armor, without the noise, because under all the resentment and distance, there's still a thread between us. Frayed, yes, but not broken, and maybe that's all any of us are trying to do in the end. Follow that thread back to each other, one honest word at a time. There's something no one prepares you for when you grow up, the moment when love starts to feel like a debt. I used to carry this invisible weight on my shoulders, this sense that I owed my parents something I could never fully repay, not because they said it outright, at least not at first, but because it was always there, lingering behind their words, especially his. After everything I've done for you. It's a sentence that always lands heavy. It sounds like a statement of fact, but it's really a kind of quiet accusation. And the worst part? It's not wrong. He did a lot for me, more than I ever said thank you for. But something about the way it was brought up made me feel like I was being measured, like my love was being audited. I remember once, during a holiday dinner, I brought up something light, a small decision I made about my job, nothing dramatic. He frowned and said, "That's the direction you're going after how much we sacrificed?" I laughed it off in the moment, but something inside me recoiled, not from the judgment, I'd gotten used to that, but from the implication that my life was some kind of repayment plan. And maybe that's the issue. Love shouldn't feel transactional, but when parents tie their sacrifices to expectations, it starts to. And gratitude, when demanded instead of offered, turns into guilt. The irony? I am grateful. So deeply it hurts. I think about the nights he worked late, the times he held the family together when everything felt like it was falling apart. I remember the car rides to school when he'd pretend not to notice how nervous I was before a test, just humming along to old songs on the radio. I remember him showing up over and over in his own way, but when that love is used as leverage, when it's thrown back in your face like a receipt, it warps everything. You stop feeling seen. You start feeling like a disappointment wrapped in unspoken debt. It took me a long time to understand that my guilt wasn't really mine. It was inherited, conditioned. I grew up believing that the best way to show love was through obedience and sacrifice. So I tried. I tried so hard to be the good son, the kind who doesn't make waves, the kind who nods and agrees and never lets his parents feel unappreciated. But inside, I was crumbling, because love that comes with strings doesn't nourish you, it chokes you. Carl Jung once said that what remains unconscious becomes our fate, and I think about how many people are walking around with the unconscious belief that their worth is tied to how grateful they appear, how much they give back, how little they ask for, how much they suppress. That's not love, that's performance. And it goes both ways. I've seen kids who never say thank you, who take their parents for granted. I've been that kid sometimes, wrapped up in my own life, too distracted to call, too proud to acknowledge everything they gave. And it's true. Some kinds of gratitude aren't instinctive. They take maturity, humility, and presence. But when both sides wait for acknowledgement, when parents wait to be thanked, and children wait to be understood, all that's left is silence. What changed things for me wasn't some big conversation. It was a small one. I sent a message one evening, not on a birthday or holiday, just randomly, and said, "Hey, I was thinking about all the ways you showed up for me when I was a kid. I probably never said it, but thank you. He didn't reply for hours, and when he did, it was just, that means a lot. No follow-up, no emotional flood. But I felt something shift, like a brick was removed from the wall, and I realized then, maybe all he ever wanted was to know he mattered, not to be repaid, not to be worshipped, just to be seen. We all want that, don't we? So now I try to practice gratitude without guilt. I say thank you when I mean it. I express appreciation not because it's owed, but because it feels right. And I remind myself that I don't have to carry the weight of someone else's unmet emotional needs. I can love my father deeply and still protect my own boundaries. I can acknowledge the past without living inside it. Gratitude should feel like a bridge, not a burden. Something that connects us, not something we throw at each other when we feel unappreciated. And if I ever become a parent, I hope I remember this, that the love I give should never come with an invoice, that the greatest gift isn't in being thanked, it's in seeing your child thrive in their own way, knowing you helped plant the roots that let them grow. That's the kind of legacy I want to leave, one that doesn't ask to be repaid, only remembered. I used to think freedom meant cutting ties, like the only way I could really be myself was by getting as far away as possible, not just physically, but emotionally too, from my parents, from their voices in my head, from the sense that everything I did was somehow being watched, measured, corrected. It wasn't rebellion, not really. It was more like gasping for air after being underwater too long. I needed space, not to reject them, but to remember who I was without them. But that's the thing about growing up. You don't just become your own person. You also have to find a way to redefine the people who raised you. And that's messy, because while I was trying to break free, I think they were still trying to hold on. There's this moment that sticks with me. I had just moved into my first apartment, and I was so damn proud. It was small, barely furnished, but it was mine. I called my dad to tell him, and his first response wasn't, "That's great," or "Congrats." It was, "Did you sign a lease without talking to me first?" I know he didn't mean to ruin the moment, but that one question, it said everything. That he still saw me as a kid. That no matter how old I got, some part of him still needed to feel involved, in control, relevant. And honestly, I get it now. For him, giving advice wasn't about power. It was his way of showing love, his way of saying, "I'm still here, I still want to protect you." But at the time, all I heard was, "You're not capable without me." That's the paradox we never talk about. How parents can love us so much that they forget to let us go. And how children can crave independence so deeply that they forget their parents are grieving a version of us that's disappearing. Carl Jung talked about individuation, the process of becoming who we truly are, separate from the identities projected onto us. And no stage of life demands that more fiercely than the one where you step out of your family's orbit and try to define yourself on your own terms. But that separation, it doesn't always come cleanly. Sometimes it comes with slammed doors, unanswered calls, arguments that spiral out of nowhere. Sometimes it looks like shutting down, pulling away, growing colder, not because you've stopped loving them, but because you don't know how to stay close without losing yourself. And then, one day, you realize how alone they must feel, how much it must hurt to watch the person you once bathed, fed, taught to walk, suddenly stop asking for your opinion, suddenly not need you in the same way. I didn't see that before. I was too busy trying to breathe. But now I try to hold both truths, that I have the right to make my own decisions, even bad ones, that autonomy is sacred and hard-earned, and that he has the right to feel the ache of that shift, even if he doesn't always handle it with grace. It's a delicate balance. When he offers advice now, I don't bristle like I used to. I still decide for myself, but I've learned to hear the care beneath the control. I say, "Thanks, I'll think about that," and I mean it. Not because I need approval, but because I've stopped needing conflict to prove I'm free. And sometimes, when I'm really honest, I miss being the one who was looked after. I miss the simplicity of knowing someone else would take care of things. Being an adult is complicated, lonely even, but I also know I can't go back, and I don't want to. What I want is something new, a relationship that evolves, where he can share his experience without trying to steer my life, where I can listen without feeling suffocated, where we can both be human, flawed, and still show up for each other. That kind of relationship doesn't come from fighting for power. It comes from letting go of control, his and mine, and choosing connection instead. So now when he says, "I just want what's best for you," I say, "I know, me too." And somehow those words feel like a bridge. There's a particular kind of silence that settles in when you start avoiding the past. It's not peaceful, it's not healing. It's the kind of silence that hums beneath every conversation, like an old radio left on in another room. You don't hear the words, but you feel the static. That's what it was like between me and my dad for years. We never talked about the stuff that actually hurt. Not the things he said when I was younger. Not the times I felt small or ashamed or invisible. And he never brought up the moments when he felt disappointed or rejected. We both just kept moving forward as if time could erase what we never dared to say. But the past doesn't disappear. It lingers. In the pauses between sentences, in the tension that rises during a simple disagreement, in the way you flinch when a familiar tone slips into someone's voice. It shows up when you least expect it, not as a memory, but as a reaction you can't explain. For the longest time, I thought the best way to deal with it was to stay quiet, to keep things light. I told myself, he doesn't remember that moment. It's not worth bringing up. Why stir the pot? I convinced myself that ignoring it was maturity. But really, it was fear. Fear that if we opened that door, everything would come pouring out, and we wouldn't know how to clean it up. He did the same in his own way. He'd drop comments like, "You've always been stubborn, even as a kid," or "You never listened back then either." Little digs coated in nostalgia that still stung. And I'd smile, nod, let them pass, even though they tightened something in my chest every single time. We were both keeping score, quietly, painfully, hoping the other would eventually acknowledge the wounds without either of us having to say, "I'm still bleeding." Carl Jung once said that we are not what happened to us. We are what we choose to become. But you can't choose anything clearly if the past is still clouding your vision. You can't build a healthy present on a foundation full of cracks. It wasn't until a conversation a few months ago that things shifted. We were talking about something small, something dumb, honestly. And out of nowhere, he said, "I don't know why you always take everything so personally." And I snapped, not loudly, just honestly. I said, "Because I do take things personally when they come from the person who was supposed to protect me." It was quiet after that. He didn't speak, neither did I. And in that silence, I felt more vulnerable than I had in years. I thought he'd get defensive, thought he'd laugh it off or change the subject. But after a long pause, he just said, "I didn't know it still hurt." Something cracked in me, not in a bad way, in a necessary way. Because the truth is, I didn't know either. I thought I was over it, thought I'd buried it deep enough to forget. But healing isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering safely. That moment didn't fix everything, but it opened a door. It gave us permission to speak without turning it into a war, to say, "That hurt," without also saying, "You're a bad parent." To acknowledge, "I needed more," without blaming or accusing, just naming the wound so it could stop festering in the dark. Since then, we've had a few more of those conversations. They're awkward, clumsy, full of long silences and half-finished sentences, but they're real, and that's something we never had before. I think that's one of the greatest gifts we can offer the people we love, the chance to be seen in their mistakes without being defined by them, the chance to grow together, even if the timeline wasn't perfect. Because when we hold on to old pain without speaking it, we rob both ourselves and them of the chance to transform it. And healing, I've learned, isn't about erasing what happened. It's about changing what it means. Now, when he brings up the past, I try not to brace myself. I try to listen without expecting judgment. And sometimes I even ask questions. What were you going through back then? Or, why did you think that was the right choice at the time? It's strange how freeing it is to look at your history without flinching, to realize that the people who hurt you were also hurting, and that while that doesn't excuse everything, it does explain a lot. We still don't agree on everything. We probably never will, but we've stopped pretending, and that in itself feels like a kind of peace. It took me years to understand that what I wanted most from him wasn't answers or approval. It was to be heard, really heard, not interrupted, not fixed, not compared to his past or someone else's present, just listened to. And once I saw that, I realized he probably wanted the same from me. It's easy to underestimate the power of simply sitting with someone in their truth, especially when that truth makes you uncomfortable. But that's where everything begins to shift. Not in the arguments or explanations, but in the quiet moments when you choose to stay present, even when it's hard. I remember one afternoon he called just to check in. Nothing special, but his voice was softer than usual, slower. I could hear something in it. Not sadness exactly, but something tender, almost fragile. We talked about his day, about how the house was quieter now, how he'd gone through some old boxes and found drawings I'd made when I was 6. He laughed at how bad they were, and then, in the middle of that laughter, he said something I didn't expect. You were always sensitive. I didn't know how to handle that. There was no bitterness in his voice, no blame, just honesty. And in that moment, everything I'd been trying to get him to say for years, not the apology, but the acknowledgement, came through. It didn't fix everything, but it filled a space that had been hollow for a long time. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I didn't turn it into a therapy session. I just said, yeah, I think I needed more space to feel safe. And he said, I wish I'd known that back then. That's when I understood something I'd missed for a long time. We both did the best we could with what we had and what we knew. And part of growing up isn't just forgiving your parents. It's realizing they were people before they were ever your parents. People with fears, blind spots, pain they never named. Carl Jung once said, the greatest gift we can offer someone is to be a mirror, not a judge, to reflect their truth without distortion. That's what I'm trying to do now. With him, with myself, to stop demanding perfection and start embracing presence. Because here's the thing, it's not too late. Not for most of us. The relationship we want might never look the way we imagined, but it can still be real, still be warm, still be healing. It doesn't have to be built on shared opinions or perfect memories. It can be built on something simpler, the willingness to show up as we are without pretending or performing. We don't have deep talks every week now. Sometimes we still argue. Sometimes I still feel that old resistance rising up in me. But now I know how to breathe through it. I know how to listen without defending. And I know how to say what's real without making it a fight. And he listens too, not always perfectly, but more than before. And when he doesn't understand something, he says, explain it to me, instead of dismissing it. That one sentence, it changes everything. I think love, at its core, is just attention. The kind of attention that says, "You matter enough for me to try, even when it's hard, even when I don't fully get it." That's what I want to keep practicing, with him, with everyone I love. Because in the end, healing isn't about rewriting the past. It's about choosing how we meet each other now. It's about creating new patterns, new stories, new ways of being together, ones that aren't built on guilt or duty, but on honesty, respect, and quiet care. So if you're still holding pain from someone you love, maybe you don't need to fix it all at once. Maybe you just need one moment of presence, one sentence of truth, one quiet breath between two open hearts. Sometimes that's all it takes to begin again.